Hey, today we're going to talk about some more controversial kind of issues with the historiography of some of the ancient stuff that we've been working through. And the big one that we're going to address today is one that I'm personally pretty conflicted about. And I like these kinds of ones that I don't have a clear idea on where really I stand on the issue. Um, This one stems of a piece of legislation passed in 1990 by the United States Congress and then signed off on by the President George H.W. Bush at the time. Uh, this is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, shortened to NAGPRA. Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This requires any federal agency and institution, so National Park Service, national museums, any federal agencies that get federal monies, they have to return Native American cultural items to Indian nations, Native American nations. Uh, and part of the reason for this is that prior to really the 1980s, uh, and especially back in the early 1900s and even the late 1800s, there was sort of a Wild West period of archaeology. And there wasn't a ton of respect paid and not really too much of an idea of really careful preservation for the remains of Native Americans or the cultures of those groups. Archaeologists were just going out into burial grounds and other places and not really consulting any of the people that had ancestors at those burial grounds. Um, and some things were even stolen from burial grounds with active tribes on the reservations. And so, this is kind of akin to, well, like a great example. On the south end of Calhoun's campus, there is a graveyard, and some of those graves date back to the 1880s. And this would be like, me as a historian. I'm not going to do this, but this would be like me not asking the property owners of that graveyard if I could go and excavate and just going over there with a shovel one day, just digging up people. That's not cool, and we do need to be careful. We do need to use archaeology to study our history, but there's some considerations that we have to make, and unfortunately, a lot of people were not being very considerate and not, being mindful of their actions. Um, a great example of, we're going to get into some rough examples later on, but a great example back in the 1970s, that recent, a highway was going through Oklahoma, and on building that highway, they uncovered 26 skeletons. A couple of those skeletons were the skeletons of some white people, and there were some Native Americans remains as well. Um, the white remains were quickly reburied, and the Native Americans were remains were just sent off to a museum. Um, as a historian, I kind of find it, well, all of those remains would be pretty interesting for the study of history, so all of them should have gone to a museum, not just the Native American ones. But we're kind of, nobody was consulted. We're just going to, hey, these Native Americans are them, and so we're just going to chuck them over to the museum, and those white remains will be hastily reburied because some reason. So like I said, though, this was kind of a Wild West period where anything went. And in some cases, some bad stuff went on. And our next video will talk about one of the more egregious examples of bad stuff that went on. Um, Now, NAGPRA does not apply to private lands. So, say if you own some land and you dig up and find Native American artifacts, the government's not going to come and take those from you or mandate that you return those to the Native Americans that originally owned them or something like that. This applies to federal lands and museums that get federal monies. Uh, It also requires, these museums and parks to maintain an inventory of all of these remains. And to date, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 32,000 individuals, complete remains have been returned to their respective groups. And so that's kind of cool. That's good that these people's ancestors were returned to them, but at the same time, like I said, I'm a historian and kind of biased here, and so I feel like sometimes we are kind of losing out on the research and the knowledge that we can gain from these remains. And a great example of a spot where I feel that NAGPRA might have gone a little bit too far afield was the case of Kennewick Man. It's Kennewick. This set of remains was found near Kennewick, Washington, in 1996. It was a complete skeleton. It was in a creek bed, and erosion had washed some of the skeleton out. A couple of hikers had discovered it. They initially called the police because it possibly, it was a body, and so, or it was a skeleton anyway, and so they thought that maybe somebody had been killed and dumped out there. And quickly, after the cops come and some other people are called, it's realized that this is not a recent death. Carbon-14 ultimately dated Kennewick Man to about 10,000 years ago. Most archaeologists argue at the latest, humans arrived into North America around 14,000 years ago. So this is one of the earliest examples of new arrivals to North America. And so this is a tremendous, tremendous find. And these remains are super, super scientifically valuable. DNA testing was done on Kennewick Man, and he was determined to be related to, Native Americans, more closely to Native Americans than other groups. And the Nez Perce tribe quickly, along with 4 other tribes, but the Nez Perce tribe was the only one to offer up some DNA to establish that, hey, we're actually, do have genetic ties to this person. And they filed under the Native American Graves Protection and Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to have Kennewick Man returned. And so he was found in 1996, and in September of 2016, very recently, the United States Congress, the House as well as the Senate, passed legislation to return him to the Nez Perce. They're the only ones that offer DNA and a scientific relationship with this person. And he was returned to the Nez Perce, who the Nez Perce weren't even a people back, 10,000 years ago. But he was returned to the Nez Perce, and on February the 18th in 2017, relatively recently at the filming of this video, filming in 2018, Kennewick Man was buried in an undisclosed location somewhere around Kennewick, Washington. And, I feel like this is I understand that, we do need to return remains and stuff, but Kennewick Man's 10,000 years old, and there's all kinds of stuff that we could learn from him. And it was only available to be studied for about 20 years. And, think about King Tut from the last video, was discovered in 1922. All of the research and the scientific methods, CT scans and DNA and stuff that have emerged over the years that have enabled us to learn more and more about King Tut. Well, we don't have that opportunity with Kennewick Man and other Native Americans, um, because in large part, early archaeologists were not, respectful and careful in seeking out remains and artifacts and stuff, and so those guys sort of ruined things a little bit. Um, and so it's, to me as a historian, it's kind of a tragedy that we've lost Kennewick Man for further study. But at the same time, I do understand that's somebody's remains, and somebody at some point was related to Kennewick Man. So anyway, uh, we will explore this concept in the next video some more. So keep an eye out.